Hi everyone, welcome to the Unhandled Exception podcast. I'm Dan Clark and this is episode number 19. And today's episode is all about Blazor. Now I've been really looking forward to this episode because I am a .NET developer at heart, but I do front-end work too, and I've done Vue.js, Angular, React, but to be honest, I'm not a huge fan of them. And the idea of being able to drop those and use .NET on the front end really appeals. And who better to join me on the show to talk about Blazor but someone who has written a book on the topic, Mr. Chris Sainty. Welcome to the show, Chris.
Hi Dan, thanks for having me.
You're more than welcome. So for the listeners, Chris is a Microsoft MVP, speaker and principal software developer at a company called Deployed, also an author of a Manning ebook called Blazor in Action, and we might even be doing a little giveaway. And also Chris is an open source contributor working on a set of Blazor libraries and components called Blazor. So basically everything about Blazor. Is there anything I've missed off there, Chris?
No, that's pretty much everything. Obviously, do a bit of conference talks and stuff on the subject as well. And I'll be running a Blazor workshop at NDC Oslo later in the year as well. So yeah, very Blazor focused.
I'm jealous. I really want to have an opportunity to start a project in Blazor. I've got one specifically, which is I'm building a project for a client. It's going live this year, but the front end has been done with Angular, and I would just do anything to be able to just have a bit of time and rewrite the front end in Blazor.
You never know. Blazor's very productive. You might be able to do it in the time frame. It's,
Don't tempt me. I've got enough to do as it is. I remember thinking earlier about the last time we actually met in person. I think it was Microsoft Ignite in London. I'm assuming it was 2019 before COVID kicked off.
Oh, yeah, I think you're right. I can't believe it's that long ago, but
oh no,
it is. It's weird. This last year, 18 months, whatever, just feels like it's been a bit of a black hole for time, doesn't it? Everything seems to have passed so sort of slowly. It's really odd. It's really strange. But yeah, it would have been Ignite. Yeah. I remember having fond chats about the productivity of Todoist and stuff like that. Yeah, it's good times.
Was it you, me and Stuart Lang got in a conversation, and it was one of those really long, awesome geek outs about tons of different topics? I'm assuming Blazor was in there somewhere.
I think it was.
And I remember thinking at the time, it's a shame this isn't recorded, as it would have made an awesome podcast episode.
I think all three of us at some point during that conversation made the comment that this would have been a really good podcast episode, because I think it did go on for quite a long time, didn't it? It was a good chat, really good chat.
I think we covered lots of stuff, but I hadn't started the podcast at that point.
Yes.
But I have now, and we are recording this time.
Yay, that's good news.
So before we start digging into Blazor, let's do this month's listener mention. And this shout out goes to David Wengier, who tweeted, "Minding my own business, listening to the latest Unhandled Exception podcast, and what do you know? I get a convenient clip to send people if they ever want to know how to pronounce my surname. Thanks, Drakan." So Drakan's me on Twitter, and he's referring to episode 18, where I mentioned near the end in the dev tip section that he helped me with a .NET Analyzer issue. And I'm really glad that I pronounced his surname correctly. So thank you for the tweet, David. So Blazor. For the listeners who have been living under a rock this past year or so, perhaps we should start with a quick elevator pitch about what Blazor is.
Yeah, that's a good place to start. So I suppose the simplest definition is Blazor is a UI framework for building client-side web applications using C# instead of JavaScript. I think that's probably the simplest way of saying it. I think there's a lot more to Blazor than that, though. So if we maybe expand on that a little bit now and sort of, I don't know, even step back in time a year or two and kind of go back to the really early days of Blazor, where it was initially kind of being built out as a direct competitor to JavaScript SPA frameworks like sort of Vue.js and Angular and React and stuff. And that's kind of been the primary use case, I guess, behind the framework. But what's then become really interesting is more recently, and certainly with .NET 6 kicking in, is the fact that it's kind of moving to be more of a general purpose UI framework where, you can now with .NET 6 run a Blazor app with MAUI to create desktop applications. And there's also been a long-running experiment called Mobile Blazor Bindings, which is using the Blazor programming model to create native mobile applications for like iOS and Android. So Blazor is a really interesting, a very interesting thing, generally speaking, because if you're a .NET developer who potentially hops around doing lots of different types of UI, maybe you work for a company who has a web front end and they have some mobile client applications or they have some desktop client applications. Blazor is really interesting because you could be in a position, with .NET 6 and stuff where you can learn Blazor as a UI layer and use it for pretty much any type of UI, which is a pretty compelling reason to look at Blazor, because there's a huge efficiency saving for not having to jump around between, say, like Xamarin Forms and XAML and bits and bobs like that for a mobile app, and then going over to desktop-based UI, which again will be another flavor of XAML and something else, and then web UI with HTML and JavaScript and things like that. And, that's, again, really, I guess, is another big selling point with Blazor is just the productivity of it. I think everybody the vast majority of people is probably a better way to say it, who come into contact with Blazor and try it out and give it a go, kind of one of the overwhelming bits of sort of feedback from it and impressions that people have from it is how productive it is and how quick it is to learn, shallow learning curve and get up to speed and be able to build some really sort of interesting apps quickly and efficiently, which I think is something that people have kind of been crying out for, really. I think there's a lot of, certainly with some of the JavaScript stuff, there's a lot of ceremony involved, there's a lot of tooling involved and stuff like that you have to learn and get up to speed. And I think people who've been around for a while remember building apps using things like WinForms and web forms, which, while I wasn't a huge fan of web forms as such, you could build stuff quite quickly with it. And I sort of see Blazor as almost what web forms should have been, I guess is probably the way to put it. I guess it was web forms, the technology wasn't right at the time for what Microsoft may be trying to do. But Blazor now kind of gives you that balance of productivity, efficiency. It's using all the standards, it's not trying to reinvent stuff and do something funky and clever with plugins or any kind of like under the hood transpilation and to JavaScript or anything like that. You're using genuine web technologies, web standards and all this kind of stuff. So yeah, I like to say it's a very interesting technology and there's a lot of elements to kind of look at with it. And it's intriguing to see where it's going to go long term, I think.
You just got me thinking about the web forms view state and having nightmares.
Yeah, I know. You're breaking cold sweats, don't you? It's like, oh no, the view state. Yeah.
But you're totally right, though. With productivity, ignoring the view state, it was very productive. Just like you mentioned WinForms as well for desktop development. I still use that for knocking out quick internal tools because it's just so quick.
Yeah, definitely. And I think that's what a lot of people are finding with Blazor. They're getting that sort of similar feel of productivity from it. But you're not doing the more nasty, you're not ending up with the nastiness of view state with it and stuff, which is, that's hence why I mean, like, it's kind of what almost feels like web forms should have been rather than, or what it tried to be, maybe, is probably.
So you did touch on web, mobile, desktop then, but I think it's important to really emphasize that point. So we're talking about in the future, we'll be able to write Blazor components that are going to work across web, desktop cross-platform, so creating desktop applications cross-platform, mobile cross-platform natively. So basically all the things in Blazor using the same technology stack.
Yeah, basically. I mean, there's a few caveats I'll stick in there just to cover myself. So the mobile Blazor bindings is an experimental project. So Microsoft hasn't actually committed to doing that yet. That's been being sort of principally run by Elon Lipton at Microsoft. There's a GitHub repo and there's been loads of community contributions to it. And it's a really interesting use case. And I wrote a little mini blog post series on it because I've always been a web developer and I found I've never really got on with XAML. I've just not, I don't know, it just wasn't for me. I just don't gel with it.
Chris can see me nodding in the webcam.
Yeah. So the idea of using the Blazor kind of programming model to build truly native UI was very appealing. So I wrote a little mini blog post series of native mobile app development for web developers using mobile Blazor binding. So that was quite an interesting one. But like I say, it is an experiment and there isn't a commitment. There is also, with the components you write in mobile Blazor bindings, they're not compatible with the web. So you can't take a component that you've written in a mobile Blazor bindings application and run it in a Blazor app that's running on, Blazor WebAssembly, for example, because what happens in mobile Blazor bindings is you use the programming model. So it's the same style of kind of writing the markup and everything. But what it does under the hood is it uses kind of Xamarin Forms technology to translate that into a native UI element. So you can use CSS styling as well. So if you are a web developer, you can kind of really get up to speed with it very quickly, but you can't transfer those components between true web applications and native. But you can translate all of your skills. So if you've learned Blazor, it's a very quick thing to get up and running with it. However, the web versions of components and the version of Blazor, at least that's in the .NET 6 preview, which will run desktop-wise, those components should be interchangeable, because essentially you are running kind of like a mini web server in the desktop application. So it's the same sort of style as Electron, but it's not Electron. It uses a new control called Web Window, but it's a genuine control rather than just a shell that's booting up a JavaScript application. So I've not had a huge amount of time to play with it, unfortunately. I've just had a very, very quick look at it. But yeah, it's like I say, those ones are compatible with the web. So that's certainly one way you can swap things about a bit.
Very cool. I think with not just Blazor, but also .NET MAUI and just the whole cross-platform nature of it, whether using .NET MAUI SAML files or whether using Blazor components. And I think, am I right that you can use either or, so you can mix them in your applications? I think you can put Blazor components inside a .NET MAUI application.
Yeah, I mean, I think what you do is you've got a MAUI app and you'd use this web window and you just put that control wherever you want it to be among all of your other native XAML controls, whatever they are, and it will then just load your app into that area. So your app might only be one component, and it depends obviously what you're doing with it. But like I say, I'll caveat that one is that I've not extensively played with it yet, so I don't have loads of detail exactly how it works. And mainly as well, I think as well, for me personally, I'm very much a web-based developer. I don't really ever write desktop app. Well, I've never written a desktop app actually. So yeah, there's other bits I'm sort of focused on at the moment more than that. But I think if you are interested in that, I think there's a lot of very interesting things coming with .NET MAUI.
Yeah, definitely. I think also, just to add on to what you just said, I don't think it's just a Blazor web view sitting inside the .NET MAUI app. And I could be wrong with, I'm remembering back to early last year when Scott Hunter did a talk on this at .NET Oxford. But I believe he was saying that the component inside the web view can communicate with components that are just .NET MAUI components outside the web view.
Yes, yeah, no, I think you're right. Yes, yeah, I think it's similar to when you run, because you can also run Blazor components inside of like an MVC app or a Razor page application, and you can use a tag helper that runs a single component sitting in a Razor page, and again, that can communicate back and forth. So I think it's probably the same principle in the MAUI apps.
An exciting time to be a .NET developer.
Yeah, it's very interesting.
So we should probably step back a bit, because with Blazor, there's this whole concept of, you've mentioned WebAssembly, but we've got this WebAssembly and the server-side Blazor. I know I've definitely got a few thoughts about my preference out of those two, but we probably should step back and say what they are first.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, cool. So the difference between Blazor WebAssembly and Blazor Server is just where they're run. So Blazor WebAssembly runs fully in the client browser and is the equivalent of a JavaScript SPA application. Blazor Server runs, as the name suggests, on a server, and that's more akin to an MVC application or a Razor page application. Now, if we start with the WebAssembly version of it, what happens there is there's a .NET runtime, which is a mono-based .NET runtime, and that gets compiled to WebAssembly. Now, WebAssembly is a web standard. It sits alongside HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. It's supported by all the major browsers and has been for many years now. And what happens is that .NET runtime that's compiled to WebAssembly gets kind of bootstrapped in the browser by a small piece of JavaScript. And then all of your application DLLs get loaded and executed using like a interpreter, essentially. So what most people who are new to Blazor WebAssembly kind of get taken aback by is they think that their application is compiled to WebAssembly, which at the moment it's not. I say at the moment because that is something that's coming in .NET 6. There'll be something called AOT, which is ahead of time compiling. And with that, you'll be able to compile your application fully to WebAssembly ahead of time. Now, that has a trade-off there that your application size is a bit bigger, but you do get a much better performance level out of your app. So I think it's something quite high, like 5 times sort of higher performance. So it's quite a big deal, but the trade-off is you're getting about double the size of the application. So that's kind of the WebAssembly side of it. The server side is, like I said, it executes on the server. So you're running on the usual .NET runtime that you'd have on a server. You can do all the funky stuff you'd do on the server, like, access file systems and all that kind of good stuff. And the kind of SPA feel is created by a SignalR connection between the client browser and the server app. So you can think of a Blazor server app sort of similar to like a client terminal application. So a small runtime is downloaded to the browser. That sets up a SignalR connection that connects back to the server. And then every interaction that the user has with the application gets sent over that SignalR connection back to the server where it's processed. New UI updates may be created based on that action. They are then sent back down over the SignalR connection. And then that small sort of Blazor runtime will unpack that and apply those changes to the local DOM, and the user will see those changes. What's quite interesting is that while I think a lot of people, when they hear about Blazor Server for the first time, hear that back and forth and think, oh my God, that must be incredibly inefficient. But the message size is tiny, like it's a sort of tens of bytes or maybe 100 bytes at a time. And it's incredibly efficient and it's very, very fast. So when you're actually running these side by side, you pretty much can't tell the difference. Unless you've got the browser tools open, you can see that one's using SignalR like through a WebSocket or something and the other isn't. There's no real way to tell the difference. The feel for the end user is pretty much identical. It feels like a SPA. It feels like it's running locally. It's fast. It's got that dynamism you get from a SPA app where things just happen and stuff like that. But it is all going back to the server. So they're two very different approaches, but they actually give the same end result to the user, which is really interesting. And I think Blazor Server tends to, get glossed over more. I think people tend to be far more focused on the WebAssembly version of Blazor, but there's a lot of interesting use cases for Blazor Server, and it's actually a very performant hosting model, contrary to what people what people think of it when they first hear about it.
So does Blazor Server, for everyone that's on your website, not just when requests are coming in, presumably it's got to allocate resources for every single user that happens to be on your site ongoingly, where with an API, it's only using that resource when a request comes in to return a response. With Blazor Server, is it for every single user that's on your website, it's got to allocate some resources on the server?
Yeah, essentially. I mean, it's got to maintain that connection to all of the clients. So if you've got an application running on a server and you've got 100 people on your site at once, it's maintaining 100 connections to all of those clients. And this is kind of where you have, I guess, a trade-off with Blazor Server and Blazor WebAssembly. So Blazor Server in that instance is going to be a much heavier cost on your infrastructure because it's got to maintain all these connections. There was some testing done. It's probably about 18 months ago now, maybe even 2 years actually, thinking about it, by the Blazor team about how Blazor Server scales and what kind of impact the server hardware has on the scalability of the application. And they essentially found that it was RAM that really dictated how sort of well the server could scale. So the more RAM you had, the more sort of memory it had, therefore the more connections it can maintain and handle that. So so if you're using Blazor Server, you are going to look at cloud cost. If you're using something like Azure, for example, and using app service, you're going to have possibly a slightly higher app service charge because of that. But WebAssembly, you're quite right, because you'd be probably calling an API from that. You've got more of a traditional API there, so you get a lot lower server costs and stuff. And what's nice about Blazor WebAssembly is that it can actually run on any static hosting service, because the files are just static files once the app's actually built. So you can run it on GitHub Pages, you can run it on something like Netlify, you can run it on Azure Static Web Apps, all those kinds of things. You can run it out of an S3 bucket on AWS. So you can actually run a Blazor WebAssembly app sort of entirely for free if you only have to worry about the back end if you want to. But then you've got to download a lot more to the client in the first place. So trade-offs there depending on what you're doing.
When I played with Blazor last year, I've not done much with it, I just played with it. I quite often saw is that an overlay that says your connection has dropped if you stop the server. So like having that kind of experience from a user, I guess that would put me off using the server Blazor, I guess.
Yeah, definitely. It's that kind of translucent overlay you get with Blazor Server is kind of, I think, something that puts a lot of people off. And again, it's just like everything else with what we do. I guess it's picking the right tool for the job. If you've got people who are going to be accessing an application, they're going to be doing that from unstable connections, then Blazor Server probably isn't going to be the best choice, because every time that connection's lost, because you are dealing with a server sort of rendered app, or sorry, because the app is actually running on the server, it's rendering in your browser, but it's running on your server. The moment that connection's lost, you don't have an app anymore. So, that you're going to get that overlay quite a lot, and that's going to not be a very nice experience. So yeah, it's about choosing the right thing for the job. If you're running, say, on an intranet, on a corporate intranet, for example, for an internal app, then Blazor Server might be an amazing choice because it's going to be lightning fast. You've got stable connections, and yeah, you haven't got to worry about having an API and a client. You can just sort of build one app, and it's already running on your server, so you can, it can go off talking to DBs or whatever it needs to do, and you can build. Come back to what we talked about earlier about efficiency. You can build something very quickly that's very useful.
Yeah, I guess from a debugging point of view, that's probably a lot easier on Blazor Server.
Yeah, I mean, the debugging experience of Blazor Server is essentially no different to any other .NET application. If you're running in Visual Studio, for example, you run it with F5 and you can set your breakpoints and stop and debug through. And yeah, it's absolutely fine. The debugging experience for Blazor WebAssembly is pretty much the same. There's a little bit more going on with Blazor WebAssembly. So it's still, I think there's still definitely some improvements that could be made there. But, again, you can usually get most of your debugging to work in a similar way there as well.
Oh, wow. So WebAssembly, which is running in the browser, you can still put breakpoints in Visual Studio.
Yeah, it's really nuts. So it's well above my level of intelligence to understand exactly how everything goes on under the hood. But from my limited understanding of it, essentially it kind of runs you've got your, the app runs up, you run it all up in Visual Studio, and it creates like a proxy debugging server or something that attaches to the browser, and then it kind of relays through that back to Visual Studio, so you can set breakpoints there and it will trigger through the browser and stuff. And you can actually load C# files up in the browser dev tools and set breakpoints there and have it stop on those as well. There's a load of information on the Microsoft Docs site, the Blazor area, that sort of tell you about how you can work with those different debug modes. What I found that's really weird as well for me is that I think because I was sort of grown with Blazor since it sort of before it was first released, I got so used to using console write lines for debugging that I almost never use debugging. It's sort of my colleagues I work with, they use it now and then for stuff. And I'm like, oh, if you just threw a console write line in there, you could spit that out much quicker, and it would just then we could just see what it says and get on with it. I'm like gone back to debugging from like the 90s or something, where I'm just console write line this, console write line that.
I think they call that poor man's debugging, don't they?
It is poor man's debugging, yeah, it's really mad. But it's like habit. I was like doing it for like best part of, probably a year or more at least. And so you just kind of get ingrained in these weird things. I really kind of need to retrain my mind, to be honest.
My mind's still blown about that you can debug front end from your IDE, because when I've done Angular, Vue, React stuff, I just hate debugging through like F12, Chrome DevTools, and it's just not as nice an experience. So that sold me even more on Blazor if I can do that in the IDE.
Yeah, well, I think possibly an even bigger sell for you might be the fact that, because I believe you're a big Rider fan, aren't you?
That was going to be my next question.
Yeah. So the latest, I don't know if it's in the latest released version of Rider, but I think it's definitely in the EAPs at the moment, is support for debugging Blazor WebAssembly with Rider as well. So Riders, they've kind of been a bit behind the curve with that, I think, because they were getting their head round how to use this kind of proxy server, and there's quite a lot going on to make this kind of all work, as like I say, from my understanding of it. So they've taken a bit longer to catch up with where Visual Studio was, but they're there now. And again, I think it's slightly limited. It's only I think it's just a Blazor WebAssembly hosted app it will work with, or maybe even just a standalone one. I can't remember off the top of my head, but the point is it's there now, and hopefully the rest of it will kind of come through quite quickly. Because I work predominantly on a Mac, so I use Rider pretty much exclusively at the moment for debugging. It works with Visual Studio Code as well. So if you're using Visual Studio Code for development, you can do debugging from that as well with Blazor WebAssembly. That all works as well. So you've got lots of options with that.
Nice. I'm assuming that riders for new things like Blazor and .NET MAUI, because it's an external company, it's always going to have to be playing a bit of catch up. But it's so impressive how they are playing catch up so quickly. I don't know how much internal communication between Microsoft and JetBrains happens. There must be quite a bit, I guess.
You would think so, wouldn't you? I mean, I'm not sure obviously what goes on, but you would think that they probably talk to each other fairly well. I mean, it's quite impressive what's in Rider. I think it took me 3 goes, to be honest, to get comfortable with Rider. I had to go with it. I was like, no, I don't like it. Then went away, came back, mate, I don't know. And then third time round, it really stuck. And I use it as my daily IDE now, and it's amazing what's in there. But I think, in all honesty, I've probably only scratched the surface really of what it's capable of. But then that's probably the same for Visual Studio. They're both behemoths of IDEs that are incredibly powerful and incredibly useful. And it'll be interesting as well with obviously the new VS 2022 being 64-bit as well. I think that'll be sort of an interesting one from Microsoft's side about, that'll address a lot of issues I think people have had performance-wise and things like that. Obviously, Rider's already 64-bit, so it's got a jump on Visual Studio for that one. So I think it's nice that we've got this choice as .NET developers between sort of a couple of really great IDEs, because I think it then keeps both people on their toes. Like, I think JetBrains push Microsoft and vice versa, which I think is always good for us then as developers, that we get the benefit of even better tooling. And I think the .NET ecosystem, and the .NET community is lucky that we have such great tools. I think it's probably one of the strong points of our community really is the quality of our tools and how productive they are. So yeah, I think both companies are doing an amazing job with their IDs.
Yeah, definitely. And I think air quotes, new Microsoft is kind of, they're not saying you have to use Windows or you have to use our IDE. I even remember, this was quite a few years ago now, at London.NET meetup, Scott Hanselman came over and did the talk. At the end, in the question time, someone in the audience asked him, why don't you just do something so Visual Studio tramples all over Rider, like whether it's, I can't remember whether it was marketing or whether it's functionality. And Scott's answer was so good. I'll have to dig it up. I think it was recorded. And it was basically just, that's not what we're about. I can't do it justice trying to repeat it, but it's kind of, I think everyone in the audience groaned when that question was asked, but Scott answered it so well.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, at the end of the day, having a single dominant anything is never usually good for anybody.
Exactly.
Yeah. You want competition to drive things forward, and apart from anything else, you just get different approaches. I guess at the root of it is it's diversity. You need diversity to different ideas to make better solutions and things like that. So I don't think we would benefit as developers. I don't think the .NET ecosystem would benefit by having just one IDE that anyone could use, and that was the only thing. And yeah, I think the fact that there are options is the strength of the community. It's definitely not negative.
Yeah, and even like with languages, you can see that C#9 is being more functional and is taking ideas from F#, Haskell, and other languages. And without these other languages introducing other paradigms, then languages wouldn't evolve as well at all. So I think it's so important. But we have diverged a lot from Blazor.
We have, haven't we? Yeah.
So do you think that if .NET developers are like jumping on this front end stuff because they can do .NET on the front end, especially when using WebAssembly, that there might be security implications where .NET developers who are used to back-end dev forget that all their code is going to be running in the browser. The users have full access to it, or they can do whatever they want to it. They can change it. Do you think there might be security risks where we need to be very careful about how people are educated in doing Blazor development?
I guess it's an interesting one, because it depends whether we're talking about security as in the end user security versus maybe more about intellectual property protection. I think is maybe more of a potential thing. I mean, one thing that I've had many questions on over my time working with Blazor from people is, oh my God, I've just realized that all my DLLs are now in the browser. How do I obfuscate my code because someone can use it? And you can obfuscate your code. There are tools to do that. I think from my point of view, I'd probably say that if it's important enough to do that, it shouldn't be in the client in the first place. I'd probably push that stuff behind an API, because if it's that important that you feel the need to obfuscate it, then frankly, if someone's determined enough, they'll find a way to, I don't think there's, at least again, to my knowledge, there's no obfuscation that's 100%. Like if someone is determined enough, they can get through it. It's more just putting people off, making their life harder so they don't try. So I think if you've got something that's genuinely that important, the answer there is, well, don't put it in the client in the first place. Put it behind an API call and just call it from your client. So that's kind of like the intellectual property side of it. And I think that's an important thing for developers who are coming into Blazor, who have maybe been doing pure server development. That's definitely an important thing to understand, is that, this code is now running on the local machine. It is being downloaded there. So don't put anything there that you're not comfortable people being able to decompile. From an application security perspective, I guess there's kind of a lot of there's kind of built-in stuff that's going to help you there, in that for firstly, that WebAssembly applications run in the same security sandbox as JavaScript applications do in the browser. So you can't go and reach out to the user's machine. You can't suddenly write some code that goes and accesses their file system and deletes their program files folder. You just can't do that. You can't create files on the fly. You can't do any of that stuff. So while you are running a .NET runtime, you're running a restricted .NET runtime based on where it's running. So like I say, if you try and do those kind of file-based operations and things, you're just going to get a platform not supported exception, and it's not going to work. So I think from that security kind of aspect, you kind of can't really go wrong there as such, because, like I say, you're already in a sandbox.
I guess I was kind of thinking about a third scenario where, for example, if a developer just isn't used to web development at all. So I think a web developer that's used to doing Angular or React on the front end, or Vue, and writing APIs on the back end will have no trouble. But someone that's just coming into the web world, and say, for example, they're writing a bit of code that calls out to a database or Azure Storage, has connection strings as part of that code, and they're just putting it into the WebAssembly code without thinking about it, that is obviously going to be on the client side. Yeah,
no, that's a really good point, actually. Yeah. And and again, I think you're right on that one. There's definitely a bit of learning there for developers coming into this, but you can't do what you do with an MVC app and just, like you say, have a database connection string sitting in your app settings JSON file, because that file does get downloaded to the browser. And if you've got secure keys in there or anything like that, that is now, visible in the browser. Although, obviously, downloading a connection string into your browser is not going to get you very far, because it's not like you can reach out from your browser and connect to a DB directly anyway. Well, I suppose you could, but that would be a really bad idea. Yeah, there's definitely a learning curve, I guess, in that perspective. And I think it's going to be an interesting thing to see how that develops, really, because I think with Blazor, I've certainly noticed at least a lot of developers who are like, oh, I've stayed away from web development because, the chaos of JavaScript, I didn't want to get involved in it. And now I can use C#. I'm really interested in building some web apps. I think what I'd say, even probably before people are doing that, is if you're coming into building web apps with Blazor and you've only ever built desktop apps or like that kind of thing, I would probably really set aside some time to just learn about the web in the first place. I've had quite a lot of conversations with developers who ask me, how do I do this or how do I do that, with not understanding, for example, styling with CSS. Oh, well, how do I get this layout to work? It's like, well, okay, we need to use flexbox. Well, what's flexbox? Well, it's a sort of a tool within CSS that you use to control layouts. Oh, well, CSS is, I don't want to have to learn CSS. Well, the web runs with CSS. If you're going to come to this area of app development, you have to accept there's some things that have to be learned that are part of that development style. And CSS is one of those things. It's something that you can use frameworks and things to get around a lot of it. And that's definitely something, that is worth doing. But I think for anybody who's just coming into web development brand new and thinking that Blazor will allow them to just not have to learn the web, that's not the right attitude. That's not going to, you probably will be able to build stuff, but you're still going to just feel like everything's hard work at sort of pushing the boulder uphill. So yeah, I think anyone who's coming into it has got a bit of upskilling to do around those areas, and that stuff that you've mentioned, especially around connection strings and bits, is a good example of where people need to be aware of what's going on exactly.
Yeah, I think the key thing is if you're doing WebAssembly, it's just like a normal Spire app. It works with the same paradigm. if you're going to talk to a database, you still need a web API at the back end or some API at the back end to go through. So that still needs to be server side.
Yeah, definitely.
You mentioned about like web technologies. So obviously, if you're doing front end stuff, you've got these concepts of bundling and minification, and not just your actual code, like Blazor code, but CSS, JavaScript as well. How does that pipeline work? Like, what tooling is there around doing that?
Yeah. So again, this is, I guess, a very opinionated answer. Is I still tend to use npm tools for certain things because, frankly, they're really, really good. I know we in .NET sometimes really kind of look down on these tools, and I get why. I mean, I've had plenty of bad experiences with npm and kind of some JavaScript libraries that have really not played ball. So I'm totally sympathetic. But there are sort of some things that just are really, really good. And because I have done client-side development in JavaScript for a long time as well, I know them. And so for me personally, I'm just like, well, I know how to do this, so I can just do it. So you can use things like Webpack to bundle and minify your JavaScript in your CSS and things like that. You can use tools like Grunt and Gulp to do things like that as well, if you know those. And there's also other tools like Post CSS and things like that. So they all work really well with Blazor. Like the nice thing about Blazor is, again, sort of coming back to what you said about how Microsoft are nowadays, this has all been built to interop with those tools and even interop with JavaScript, and we can call JavaScript and JavaScript can call C# in Blazor. So, it doesn't kind of put you in a box. You can still reach out to these other bits of the wider front-end ecosystem and take advantage of the battle-tested packages that are available that do work really well.
I really liked when you did your talk at .NET Oxford and you demoed this with chart.js and just showed like really nice looking charts, which were JavaScript, but you componentized it. So you abstracted away the JavaScript. So it felt like you're working with a Blazor component. Going back to what you were saying before about productivity, it didn't take very long when it wasn't a lot of code. And it just looked really nice when you switched over to the browser.
Yeah, exactly. And, that's a really great example of where I don't think being like, I guess, purist, for want of a better way of putting it, of now I can run C# in the browser, everything must be .NET. I think that can be a limiting view because as .NET people, we're new to this world, essentially, because, we've been living on the server for however long. And now we've got access to the browser and we can do stuff in the browser. And, our packages and our tooling just aren't at the same level yet because we're kind of expanding into this. And I mean, don't get me wrong, there is some amazing work being done by the community to create better tools that are completely native .NET tools for doing things like bundling and minification and native Blazor components for doing things like charting and all this kind of stuff. But even so, these are new packages. At best, Blazor's been around for 3.5 years from like the get-go. So at best, these packages are going to be a year or two old versus some of these packages that have been around for 5-10 years, something like that. So the level of use is very, very different. Therefore, the battle testedness of it is very, very different. So that talk that you mentioned, that was using chart.js, which is a very popular library used by millions of people all over the world. Like, it's really, really solid. And that's why I kind of put that bit into that talk, is to sort of show people, like, look, you could find a package that someone's created that maybe is pure C# to do this, but actually there's not a huge amount of work involved in wrapping the JavaScript one, and you're getting all the benefit of this like really rich, feature-rich library that's really well battle-tested. And like you say, you can extract all that JavaScript stuff away. And then if you do find a native C#.NET package that does the same thing, you're happy with it, well, because it's all abstracted away, you can just kind of remove the lower level bits that call the JavaScript and replace that with the C# stuff, and off you go. And you're not probably don't have to worry about changing too much of your sort of high level application code as well. So there's lots of ways you can manage this. And I think everyone needs to make the decision based on obviously what their particular needs are as a business and all this kind of stuff. But I think I just urge people to not maybe just dismiss stuff out of, maybe give it a little consideration sometimes as to whether actually it'd be better just using that existing thing rather than trying to create something new as well. I see a lot of people going, oh, well, I'll just build this in .NET. And it's like, well, that's a really big, complicated thing. Like, it's taken a lot of people a lot of years to build that. Like, I don't think you're going to whip it up in a weekend. So like I say, I think the more time that goes by, the more native kind of .NET technologies there will be to do these things. And like I say, there's already NuGet packages out there that you can use that will do bundling and minification for CSS and JavaScript that don't involve you having to deal directly with NPM. Although it's quite ironic that most of them actually under the hood use NPM, but you don't have to. So if you don't want to touch it at all, you can use a package that uses it for you.
I must admit, I don't mind NPM. It's quite, as you say, there's so many great packages out there. There's a lot of rubbish packages as well. So you've got to look at what you're installing. But I think things like Webpack, if you're doing it yourself, the configuration, it can get very complicated and people hate it. Even if you're using React, there's a tool called Create React App, which just scaffolds all this for you. So you just don't have to deal with it. I guess maybe because I've done web development like yourself for quite a while, that doesn't scare me off. But I can picture someone that's just not used to web at all, thinking that if they think that Blazor is just going to mean that they don't need to understand any of the web world, then that might be a shock to the system.
Yeah, definitely. And like I say, I totally sympathize if you're someone who hasn't, like me and you, hasn't had the experience using JavaScript frameworks and the tooling ecosystem. I totally understand why you'd not want to get involved in it. It's something that I said at the start, hence why I said it's my opinionated answer, because with my experience, I'm happy to play around with those things. But if you didn't have that experience, I totally get why you wouldn't want to even try. Like, it is daunting. It is, like you say, if you've ever read the Webpack docs to set up the configuration, like, yeah, no, just walk away.
It's not like bedtime reading, I don't think.
It's not, is it? It's not pleasant. It's not. It's one of the things you read the first page of it, and then you go, okay, cool, I'll read that 5 more times, and then I might know a little bit about what they're talking about. So yeah, but like I say, there are, every day there's more packages coming out for Blazor as more and more people are getting on board with it. I mean, it's skyrocketing in terms of its popularity. I think Microsoft have kind of been quite open in the last sort of couple of conferences they've had about Blazor's sort of the fastest growing area of the whole .NET kind of family, I think, at the moment. So these tools are going to be there. Like, harks back to a bit of what I said earlier, really, in the .NET world, we're really lucky to have amazing tooling and stuff like that. So I have no doubt that there'll be really, really good stuff for all this that will be totally out of the JavaScript world and 100% in the .NET world, and people can take advantage of those things. And I probably will, to be honest, as well. And yeah, so yeah, there's something for everyone. I think that's the point. That's probably the ultimate soundbite, is there's something for everyone with whatever you're comfortable with.
Nice. I remember when Blazor very first started being announced and spoken about. At the start, I was thinking, is this just a fad and gimmicky? It's kind of like running C# on the front end. But now it's clearly so much more mature, and it's definitely a thing that, as you say, is becoming super popular. So this is something like, for my projects from now on, this is going to be my go-to, like, WebAssembly version. So it's basically taking over where I would have used React or Angular. Definitely Blazor. One thing I really like, and I think you pointed this out as one of your pros in your talk, was using shared DTOs. Like, at the moment, if I'm doing like an Angular or React app and I've got a ASP.NET web API at the back end, I've got DTOs in .NET, which is serialized in the response. Then it goes to the web front end, and I've got to replicate that in like an Angular interface or class. And to be able to use, I'm assuming you can just use a shared assembly and share that between the server and pull that down into your WebAssembly front end stuff.
Yeah, exactly right. Yeah, I mean, that's it. Kind of, again, it's back to this kind of thing about productivity again. If you're using .NET on your back end, running Blazor as your front end just becomes really easy. You can do exactly what you said. You just take a .NET class library, you put your shared models, or any shared, whatever that needs to be. It could be DTOs. You could want some, some simple, I don't know, say like even I don't know, some extensions, for example. I don't know, you've got some custom string extensions or things like that. Yeah, validation. You put all of that into this shared library, reference it from your server project and your client project, and off you go. They're just there, and sort of no more have you got to worry about keeping TypeScript models in sync with C# models, or maybe you're using some code to dynamically generate TypeScript from C# at build time and all this kind of stuff. You can get rid of all that, and you can just use one set of models or DTOs and just get on with it. And it's another nice little quality of life upgrade, I think, when you're using .NET throughout the whole stack, because I think, like I mentioned in that talk, I've been bit more than once with stuff getting out of sync. And then because you always end up, when that happens, because it is two different technologies, two different worlds, you don't get good errors. Things just don't work or don't behave how you expect them to be. And then you're off on a little mad treasure hunt trying to work out where has it gone wrong. And you're using one set of tooling to debug through your React app or your Angular app or whatever. And then you're like, okay, well, I can't find it here. And then you're, okay, we'll swap over to .NET and change the tooling. And now I'm going to check through here. And, oh, this doesn't seem to make sense. Whereas, like I say, when using .NET for everything just harmonizes, and you can, like you said, we can debug, you can go straight through the whole stack and things like that. And that, using those shared projects really well is a really useful tool. And it's another good way of separating as well. Maybe you've got things that, you want shared between multiple front end apps, but you don't want it available on the back end. So you can, just have those referenced and things like that. You can share stuff between, say you've got back end packages only, you can just reference, the server can just reference that. So there's plenty of ways there of changing about what goes where and who can see what and all that. So yeah, it's a very useful thing and something that's really obvious when you first kind of say it, but actually is such a really big selling point of using Blazor.
Yeah, definitely. And even on the front end, using the HTTP client that we all know quite well, for rather than having to use and this is probably me just not knowing the HTTP clients that come with Angular and React and stuff that well, because my strength is .NET, not in Angular, even though I can use them. But the idea of being able to just use that in the front end to make the API calls just sounds brilliant. What does things like if you want to access browser-based stuff like local storage or session storage, what does that look like? Does Blazor come with functionality to do that natively?
No, so it doesn't. So this is where the kind of JavaScript interop APIs come into play. So Blazor's got a set of APIs for dealing with calling into JavaScript and for JavaScript to call back into the application. And that's how you can access these browser features. So things like local storage, session storage, all that kind of stuff you can just call through using these JavaScript APIs. But this is an example where the community steps in, so you don't necessarily have to worry about that. So, and I'm going to do a shameless plug for myself here now and go,
I knew this was coming.
Yeah, I feel like you've teed this one up for me. So yeah, literally the first open source package I've ever created was Blazor local storage. So what that does is it allows you to inject the iLocal storage service into your components, and that will deal with all of the interop to the browser APIs for you. So you don't have to worry about it. You're just dealing with a regular C# interface. You don't have to worry about the fact that under the hood it's making JavaScript calls. And I also have the same one for session storage. So there's Blazor local storage and Blazor session storage. So they both handle those things. So you can install those packages, and you just don't have to worry about that stuff. And there's lots of other browser APIs that are available, and there's lots of packages available that kind of deal with those, and you can again just install those, and someone's already done the work of wrapping those JavaScript calls for you in C#.
So while you've mentioned your library Blazor, or I say library, it's like a set of libraries and components. I'm just looking at the GitHub thing now, and there's things like fluent validation support, which I think you spoke about in your talk. Toast pop-ups and menus and various things.
There's more on there than I sometimes remember. I kind of go on there sometimes, or go on there when I'm triaging issues and bits, and it's you see the list and it's oh, there's quite a few there now. And it's probably really important to mention as well, not all of them are authored by me. So I've been able to sort of host a few packages for sort of people who wanted to sort of create a package, but they maybe wanted somewhere to put it. I've helped with maybe doing the DevOps side of it and building out their CI pipelines and things like that. But they're the ones who are actually maintaining the packages themselves. So Michael Washington, who's someone who's quite prominent in the Blazor community, he's got a package on there, a text editor that he's done on there. There's a Gitter client that was done by a guy who's known in the community as Mr. Magoo. So he kind of looks after that one and does some bits on there. So, and there's another one on there as well, which I forget the name now. I think it's a form extensions library as well. So like I say, I'm quite I try to help out others where I can with that stuff. So, but I like to mention that, like I say, not everything is purely done by me there.
My next question is probably, your answer might be that it's a community component and things, but we're talking about productivity before and web forms. One of the things I found really productive with web forms is out of the box, things like a grid, a data grid was built in, and there's lots of these different built-in components. And I know in your talk you showed like the built-in forms component, like to do a form. Is there anything for things like grids and tables? Because I find in a lot of my applications, one of the first components I need to create is actually a data grid.
Yeah. So the short answer is no. So there's the form stuff that we, like I say, we talked about or I showed you in the talk, but that's sort of it really in terms of that kind of stuff. There's no tables, there's no grids, anything like that. I don't know if Microsoft would ever release that themselves. I guess they've got a lot of partners who are building really great UI libraries. So companies like Telerik and Sync Fusion and Grape City is another one, and Dev Express, they're another one as well. So there's lots of really great companies building these really great UI frameworks and UI components. So I don't know if it would maybe be treading on their toes a bit, because I think if Microsoft created something, most people tend to always gravitate to what comes from Microsoft, I tend to find. So that might wipe out a bit of competition there, which maybe wouldn't be great. And I guess from Microsoft's point of view, their value add is probably making better framework features for people to then pick up these kind of complementary components. And like the community's created loads and loads of great packages. So there's community controls that do like material UI, if you like that kind of Google look and things like that. There is something called Fast UI from Microsoft as well. So that is from Microsoft, and they're web components, but they have Blazor wrappers for them, I think. So that is a UI library that comes from Microsoft, but it uses the Microsoft styling and things. But I think that's quite cool in that I think you can tell it to use different styling. It will dynamically change. That's something on my list to play around with. I have a very big list of things to play around with, because since I've been writing this book, I've had like no time to play around with stuff, which has been a nightmare. But anyway, so there's those bits. But from the community, there's loads and loads of sort of UI libraries and bits. So if you're looking for something, I'd be stunned if there isn't somebody who's built it already, and it's open source and things. But obviously you do have the paid for libraries if you want sort of that support, that sort of, I guess, more rigorous level of, or what's the word? More backing. So more than one or two maybe open source contributors. You've got a whole team, a whole company behind it. So maybe if you're more business controls, things like that, then you can go to companies like Telerik and get like a really solid set of UI components from them as well.
I just realised that in this entire conversation, we've said the word component about 5 billion times, but we haven't really spoken about the power of using components to, even within your own code, to just make everything so reusable and modular.
Yeah.
This is obviously the direction a lot of the JavaScript front ends have gone, like React. They're like very, very componentized.
Yeah.
Almost single responsibility principle for front end development. Like everything's componentized with one responsibility.
Yeah, components are amazing, because it's probably worth mentioning that Blazor's been heavily influenced by React. It's kind of one of the larger influences on the framework. And obviously, like you said, React's a component-based UI framework, and same Angular, Vue, they're all component-based. And components are just nice. And they work really well with when you're building web pages. Like, for example, obviously we're recording this with Zencaster, and you look at the Zencaster UI you're looking at, and we've got that bar along the top, and that could be a component. We've got the bar on the right, that could be a component. We've got the center view with the video in it, that could be a component. The web UIs sort of lend themselves really nicely to componentization. You can kind of chop these up really nice. And then you can get sort of reusability out of them. You can, you could have, I don't know, say like you have primary and secondary buttons in an application design. You can create a primary button component and a secondary button component, and you can put all of the styling into those two components, and then you can just reference those components wherever you need to and have them across your app. And then you can, your company has a rebrand and you suddenly need to change the color of your primary button. You can just go in that primary button component, change the color in there, change the style, whatever it needs to be. And then bosh, instantly you're in, every primary button on your app is now updated with the new style. So again, it harks back to the productivity side of things, that I think components allow that better productivity. I think like a lot of things though, it can be abused. I think not everything should be a component. I've had some interesting chats in the past where the view that every single thing should be a component and there should be no visible HTML anywhere is not the right way to go either. Like there's a balance to be struck here. and things, and especially with obviously these front end frameworks, because components, there's a certain overhead to maintaining a component state and for the framework to keep track of them. So once you get to extremely large levels of components, like hundreds or thousands on a page, you can slow down the app quite significantly. And I remember back from my Angular days, there was a well-known hard limit on the number of components you could have visible on a page, because Angular just couldn't cope past that, and it would do very strange things and be very sort of a very nasty user experience. So there's a balance to be had there, definitely. But I can't honestly think of building web-based UIs really, or most based UIs really, without components now. I think once you get into that mindset, it seems like it should be the only way to do it, really.
Yeah, definitely. So I believe in .NET 6 coming up, they're going to be adding support for hot reload.
Yes. Yeah. So you can already get hold of this in the preview. So I think it was preview 4, I think it first came out, and there's an improvement to it in preview 5. And yeah, I think this has got to be probably the number one thing that's been asked for, I think, from the community, really. Because, again, it's something I've probably got used to, but really it is probably the weakest point of Blazor at the moment, is that developer, like the inner loop, as Microsoft term it. Because currently the process is, even if you can use something like .NET Watch Run to run your application, and when you make changes to your components, it will then kind of pick up the change when you save the file, and then it will basically rebuild the application and reload it for you. However, that's efficient, but it's still it's several seconds between doing a change and seeing the result. And when you're doing sort of UI, front end UI development, that is really kind of sort of jolting to your development flow when you compare it to like React or Angular or Vue, where they've already got hot reload technologies where you can literally make a change and it's almost instantly available in your browser. It's really jarring when you're doing it with Blazor. You spend a lot of time waiting for a browser to refresh. Hot reload, however, just removes this whole problem. So the previews of it at the moment, I mean, that just looks amazing. I mean, the speed of it is insane. It's literally like the moment you finished typing and you press sort of Control S or Command S, depending on whatever you're using, it's just there. It's just instant, and it maintains state. So the demo that Microsoft showed, I think, was the counter page from the file new Blazor template, and you increment the counter, and then you just change something about the styling or the logic, and it just instantly starts applying that without losing the count. So I think it was Dan Roth did the demo, and he changed it so instead of incrementing the counter by 1, it incremented it by 5. The counter was on 5, and then he just hit Control S, literally hit the increment in the browser, and now it was 10. So it's not even like it's just cosmetic stuff it's saving. It's allowing you to change logic, and it's keeping the state from the result of the logic as well. Now, it doesn't quite work for everything. There's scenarios where it can't sort of keep hold of stuff, and in that case it will fall back to the traditional kind of I think they call it live reload, which is the kind of rebuild and refresh of the browser. But for most stuff, hot reload is just going to like instantly make it available in the browser, and it's going to be such a massive quality of life improvement for Blazor development. Where I work at Deployed, we're building all our apps with Blazor, obviously, and we're on .NET 5 at the moment, and we're just like literally keep having these discussions of, we could probably go on a preview, couldn't we? We could possibly go on a preview because we're yeah, exactly, yeah. So we kind of keep having these discussions of like, when can we make the jump? When can we make the jump? Because it's just going to be such a cool thing when like we can actually start using that properly. I play around with it sort of on my personal machine, and it's great. But yeah, I'm just itching to use it at work now.
Imagine it. And you're saying that Angular is like super fast. I must admit, in my Angular project, when I click save, it's not that fast.
Oh, so isn't it? I probably should caveat. I've not done Angular for quite a long while now, actually. So I'm probably about to. I know React's one's very quick with its hot reload.
It might be because I'm using third-party components on top of that, so that might be stopping it from being fast. But yeah, it takes quite a while. I remember going back to our web forms conversation earlier, where you were saying actually, like 3 or 4 seconds wait is just too long.
Yeah.
Web forms are looking like minutes and minutes wait.
Yeah. Oh, definitely. Yeah. Yeah. Well, I think I'm sure someone from the ASP.NET team said the hot reload was that quick. They were actually thinking about doing it, not even on the save, like literally as you type, because it was like it was that efficient at patching these updates to the DLLs in that they were like, maybe this is quick enough that we could do it live, like literally as you type. It's like, that would be nuts.
Presumably that would have to recognise when you've got to a point where it's compilable.
Yeah. I mean, that obviously there's going to be a lot of complicated nuance in that, I'm sure. But and I don't know if it was maybe just a bit of a jokey comment and not genuinely serious. But But like I say, it is very quick. So just like I say, just a few more previews to go, and then we can start using it properly.
Watch this space.
Yeah.
It's November, I think, isn't it?
November, yes. Yeah.
Well, they've announced .NET Conf for November, the date. So I think that's going to be the .NET 6.
Yes, .NET Conf is kind of traditionally the start of .NET Conf is usually the launch of the next version of .NET now, isn't it? So I'm sure that'll be when it happens.
Exciting times.
Yes.
So we've got this far, and we've not mentioned testing yet.
Yes.
How do you do testing in a Blazor app?
So there's a fantastic open source testing project by Eagle Hansen called BUnit. And that is kind of your default for doing testing of Blazor. It's a great project. It's been adopted now, literally in the last month, I think it was, into the .NET Foundation. So it got their backing, their support, which is really great for Eagle. He's put a phenomenal amount of work into that. And it's just a really great library. He's just thought everything through so well. He's worked, I think, quite closely with the Blazor team themselves. They've offered a lot of support to him and that about how things happen and how things work. Like I say, he's now part of the .NET Foundation as well. So he's now got that resource behind him as well. So I'm sure it's just going to go from strength to strength even more now. So that's where you start things. I mean, obviously, because this is a .NET app, really kind of any kind of unit testing or whatever you would use for regular sort of C# code you can use with Blazor. So if you've got, I don't know, some services or whatever in your UI layer that are just, regular C# code, and they're not not components or whatever, you can just use like XUnit or whatever for doing regular unit testing because it is just C# code. Where BUnit gives you the benefit is it works directly with the actual component. So that allows you to test out your components. And he's got like two different ways of doing it as well. So you can do it using like a regular C# class like you would do with XUnit and write your tests that way. But you can also use components to test components. And I think this is just like so cool. You create a component, you don't put any markup in it, you just have the code block. And in the code block, you write your tests. That means that you can use like inline Razor code to write markup that you might expect in your test result and all this kind of stuff. The premise is it's just really clever. And Eagle's got a stream now as well on Twitch where you can go and sort of he kind of shows you sort of best practices for unit testing. He's been doing quite a few talks recently at a few conferences about best practices with unit testing as well. So there's lots and lots of great information. And you've obviously got the BUnit site as well that you can go to, which it's bunit.dev, I think it is now, because he's just moved to a proper URL and everything. So there's lots of great info on that and how to do that. But that's what I've been using to test all my Blazor apps since he started working on it, really. And also, like with my Blazor libraries, I've been going through and I'm adding in test extensions that work with BUnit for them. So we've done local storage and session storage so far, and we've just been doing one for Toast. So if you're using BUnit to test your app and you're using those components, you can now use those test extensions to make testing a lot easier as well. So, and hopefully more and more components will kind of sort of come over to that as well long term. So yeah, the testing story for Blazor is really, really good.
Very cool. You already mentioned you're testing at a component level, but if you wanted, you could do it at a high-level component level, testing all the child components implicitly, or you could do it at a unit testing level, almost at a low-level component.
Yeah, I mean, what's really nice about BUnit is you can have a component under test, but if that's got lots of child components, you can look at the markup that's output, but you can also go and get the child components. Like BUnit's intelligent enough to know that what's been rendered in that component, some of it might be other components, and it has helpers to allow you to pull out other components. So to give a more realistic example, say you want to test a table and say like you've made the rows, you've done them as components, for example. You can run the table component, but you can then go and get all of the row components by using a helper of like I can't remember the exact name of the method call, but it's like, get components, and then you pass in the type of the ones you want, and it will then look at the rendered output from that component under test, go, these are components as well, and retrieve those. So you can then not have to worry about doing like CSS selectors to find out something. If you know it's already a component, you can just go and get me all instances of this component that have rendered within that parent, and then you can do whatever you want to do against them. Like, I don't know, with a table, for example, you might want to just check that it's rendered 12 rows because there was 12 items in your data set, for example. So you could just go and get all of the row components and go, just is count equal to 12. And that's it. So it's such a good library. It's so cool. But obviously you can go and get any piece of markup you want just using CSS selectors as well. So there's loads of flexibility built into it. So you can pretty much test it however you want to. And then I think if you want to go to sort of a more high level of testing with maybe like more like an end-to-end style, there's a sort of platform that's becoming quite popular now called Playwright. So that's becoming quite popular now to doing end-to-end testing, and that works with Blazor. That's not a Blazor specific thing. I think that works for any kind of sort of end-to-end testing for any type of application, but that will work with Blazor as well. So, like I say, there's no reason not to test your Blazor apps, I think, is the point here.
I think I remember, it might have been a .NET Oxford, it might have been another user group. Stuart Lang did the lightning talk on Playwright quite a while ago.
Oh, okay.
This was a few years ago, though.
Oh, that's cool, yeah.
I'm going to have to dig that up for the show notes.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, that'd be really good.
But there's a few others. There's like Cypress, and there's quite a few different front-end testing ones. But as you say, if you've got to have like selectors in the HTML to select them, this just sounds so much nicer, being able to actually get child components and just do an assert against a property in the component. It's just, you know, earlier on when I said about this project that's Angular and I can't really justify spending the time to rewrite it, I'm going to be getting in touch with them later saying, sorry, the go live date of this has been bumped back a bit. Just go and speak to Chris Sainty and he'll explain why.
Yeah, it's his fault.
This is really, really sounding at all of this stuff. That's what you just said about the testing, the hot reload coming up. Yeah, it's just, oh dear, I think I'm going to do it. I'm going to do it.
I'm not the devil on your shoulder telling you yes, but you definitely should.
I think we've actually mentioned the .NET Oxford video you did. I think that was in May, was it?
Yes, sounds right.
Quite a few times, but without actually talking about it. So that, for the listeners, that's actually on YouTube. It was recorded. And you actually had quite a lot of positive comments. Looking at one of them, someone said, this video is probably the best introduction to Blazor I've seen. And I've seen many on YouTube. And there was lots of comments. I think there was like 5,000 views, and it was only a recent video. So that just must feel so amazing, especially on YouTube, hearing comments like that.
Yeah, I mean, any positive comments on YouTube is always something you have to, be really proud of, isn't it? But that video's it's got a bit nuts. But I think it's probably fair to say it's nothing to do with me. It's very much to do with the topic. I mean, like Blazor, I think is just everyone's kind of really excited about it now, and I think it didn't disappear. I think there's a lot of people were worried it was going to be a bit of a flash in the pan, or it wasn't going to stick around for long. And I think now everyone can see that Microsoft's really behind it. They're really pushing forward with it, and it's really an integral part of their plans. Everyone's like, okay, right, now let's really get into this. And I think any sort of Blazor content gets sort of lapped up really quickly and gets a lot of interest. So I'm just always happy when people find value in a talk that I think you probably agree as a fellow speaker, like when you write, when you give talks about any subject, it's it's just nice if people find value in it. Anybody who comes to you and says that was interesting, thank you, is like that's always just the goal of what sharing and doing these talks is that really on its own. So it's just lovely that people found value in it.
Yeah, it makes it all so worthwhile. I remember when I've gone to DDD conferences and someone's come over to me and said, I've been reading your blog or something. And more recently, obviously, at that point, I hadn't started the podcast, but online where people tweet out saying that listen to the podcast, and touch wood, I've not had any negative feedback yet, which is kind of, given the internet, that's quite surprising. So, but it's really so gratifying.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, it's like you say, I think as well, it's really easy to focus on the negative sometimes as well. When I think generally most of the time, everyone's usually really positive about anything anyone does when you put yourself out there like this. If you're trying to give back a bit to the community and share some knowledge, usually most people are supportive of that. And Yeah, it's just always nice when people are nice.
That is definitely a good quote. I'll pinch that one.
Yeah, feel free.
But I'll definitely include a link to that video in the show notes. And I would highly recommend watching it to the listeners if you're interested in Blazor. And if you've made it this far in the episode, I'm guessing you probably are. And you've also got a book as well, Blazor in Action.
Yeah, getting there with it. Yeah, it's I'm currently writing chapter 8. It's hard going, I'm not going to lie. I'm not a natural writer. It was one of these things that I took on, as a bit like a personal challenge, really, is, because it's a big investment. I mean, I've been writing it for over a year. And, in terms of what that looks like, if anyone's interested, is basically getting up about 5:45 every morning and writing for about 2.5, 3 hours before I then start my day job, and doing that 6 days a week. That's kind of what it looks like for me. Now, obviously, there are breaks in between that here and there for various reasons, but essentially that tends to be what my day looks like. And it's been a really interesting experience, because writing a book just makes you think so much more deeply about a topic. So it's been a really good sort of learning experience for me from that perspective. The book's kind of been through a couple of rounds now of reviews, because Manning have like a really great process, and the book kind of gets reviewed sort of 3 times before it goes out, sort of through a group of Manning reviewers who are sort of very good at critiquing books and things like that. So we've just finished the second one of those for the 2/3 of the way through bit, and that was sort of all really positive. So that's always nice to hear that people enjoyed it. So it's just basically the last slog now, just getting it over the line. The last sort of was it 5 chapters, I think it is, that are left. And our goal is to have it ready for sort of physical publishing and shipping for just after .NET 6 comes out. The original plan was basically that it should have been in print by now. But just like I think with every book, that was way too ambitious. I was like, yeah, I'll write a chapter a month. That'll be fine. I'll get all 12 chapters in a year, job done. That is not how it works. So our plan is, we didn't want to release the book 2 or 3 months before .NET 6 came out, because it felt, obviously with the printed book, you're always kind of, you're having a snapshot in time anyway. It's not like it's online content you can constantly update. So we kind of chatted about it and decided that we'd get it all done with .NET 5. And then as soon as we were closer to November, when the .NET 6 previews were maybe more stable or whatever, we'd start swapping over any bits of content that were relevant to .NET 6. What's actually really good news is that, to be honest with you, there's not really anything changing as such with Blazor itself with .NET. There's adding a bit more functionality, but what's already there isn't really being broken, which is something Microsoft seems to be getting quite good at recently, of not really big breaking changes between releases. There certainly were a lot with Blazor while it was being initially developed. I mean, don't get me wrong there, but obviously while it's still in preview, that you kind of expect that. But going from release to release, it's been relatively painless. So yeah, in terms of what we got to update in the book for .NET 6, it's relatively small, which is good. But hopefully the book is going to be a really good introduction to anyone wanting to get into Blazor. So we've kind of aimed it at someone who's got some .NET experience, got some web experience, but obviously never used Blazor before. It just kind of takes you from start to finish with the whole framework. And along the way, I decided to go with a kind of building out an app-as-you-go model. So through the chapters of the book, you build an application called Blazing Trail, which is like a hiking app. It allows you to sort of input trails that you can go walking around and stuff. So you get to build a real app as you go. So I think I quite like that approach in a book I read once. So I like the fact that, you came out of it with a working application, and then I found I referenced that working application when I got stuck, rather than having to go plowing through the book to find the particular page that it was that talked about something. I could just nip back, double check the code, and then come back again. So I thought I'll go with that as a model for the book. And so hopefully that's useful for people as well, rather than sort of having a random example per chapter, which I think works really well for certain subjects, but not maybe so. I think UI based it's always nice to have something consistent that you're working through. So that's kind of what you do along the way, and hopefully by the end of it you come out of that knowing a lot about Blazor and confident to go and build applications with it. So
I think this is the nice thing about the Manning meme thing. Is it meme? Is it called meme? Meep, that's it.
Manning Early Access Program.
Yes, because I've actually just started reading the book. I probably should have read it before we had this chat, but I've just started reading it. So don't give away the ending.
Oh, well, no spoilers.
But Manning have very kindly actually offered to do a giveaway, so give away a free book. I'm not actually sure whether that's the physical book or the ebook, so we'll check in on that. But for anyone who wants to enter the draw, basically do a tweet mentioning the podcast, so use the hashtag unhandledexception, mention Chris's book, Blazor in Action, and mention Manning. Then we'll pick one at random. Do make sure you include the hashtag unhandledexception, because that's how I will find the tweets. And they've also got a permanent 35% discount, good for all of their products in all formats, and that's pod unhandled21. So that will give any of the listeners 35% off any of their products, which is very kind.
Yeah, Manning are really, really good with their promotional stuff. They're really good there.
Cool. So shall we do dev tips?
Yes. So, hold on.
That caught you by surprise, didn't it?
Yeah, well, I knew it was coming. Yeah, I've been thinking about. I'll be honest. I was gonna, before we say that, then I was literally gonna go. My dev tip was keep things simple.
No, that's a good one.
But I don't know if that's too simple for a dev tip.
I think that's probably one of the most important dev tips there are.
Yes, yeah, that's kind of. I was thinking about loads. I had a little brainstorming session a couple of days ago where I booked some time and okay, just 10, 15 minutes to just write out some ideas. I wrote these things down and I was like, these are all getting really convoluted. I was like, actually, you know what? The biggest thing that's helped my career is just keeping it simple. Screw it, I'll go with that. So
it's definitely a good one. I find that I see a lot of code where people try and be overly clever.
Yeah.
And I'm not even talking about using new language syntax or anything, because sometimes that can make it simple. I'm talking about things like using 5 billion layers of abstraction or something, when actually this app could have been much smaller without trying to use every single design pattern under the sun.
Yeah, it's the classic is the ridiculous levels of abstraction of the DB, because I might want to change my DB, because that happened. I know it has happened, but I think because those scenarios, I think if anyone's ever had to actually do that, even with abstractions, it never normally just works anyway. So it's still just a load of stuff for no reason. But anyway, but yeah.
I think one layer is okay. So I actually don't mind the repository pattern if we keep it simple.
Yeah.
But it's when you have 5 billion patterns on top of that as well. And it just gets, I remember this was quite a few years ago, one project I was working on. And when I started at the company, the project was already there and set in stone. But to add a new endpoint, it would take half a day to a day just to add a new endpoint, which literally was just calling into the database.
Yeah.
Because there was that many areas of the project you had to touch.
Yeah, I remember a similar project because it had facade layers in it. It was using a facade pattern, and it had about 5 facade layers in it. So every time you hit a layer, you then spent probably about 2 or 3 hours working out from where it spidered, where you came into this nice entry point. It then spidered out underneath, and you had to try and work out where you were going. Then you'd hit another facade layer, and then it would do it again. And
I think we worked on the same project.
Yeah. Maybe we did, yeah.
So my dev tip is a VS Code extension called REST Client. I don't know if you've heard of it.
Yes, I have, yes. Yeah, I think I've used it a couple of times, actually.
Oh, it's really good. So the best way to describe this is to compare it with Postman, which I'm sure a lot of our listeners know of. So it basically does the same thing as Postman. You can create requests and save them and come back to them later and send those requests out to an API and see the response, and it just visualizes it quite nicely. This REST client does the same, but it's a VS Code extension, so it allows you to send HTTP requests and view the response directly in VS Code. And the great thing I love about this is the fact that these are just .http text files, so you can put it in Git alongside your APIs. So what I could often do is, if I'm making a change to an API, in the same commit or PR, I would do a matching change in the HTTP file just to keep them in sync. And then when you open this HTTP file in VS Code, each request has almost like a code lens style hyperlink above it, and just saying send request. And then you can click on that to make request. And then VS Code creates a split panel on the right with the response data. And you can even actually copy, if you go into your browser DevTools, when you right click and say copy as curl, you can copy the curl straight into this and send a request using curl as well as the HTTP format.
Yeah, it's really cool.
Yeah, I just find this super useful. Because of the Git thing, I favor this over Postman nowadays, to be honest. And it's really handy. It's free. So I'll include a link to that in the show notes.
Yeah, that sounds really cool. Yeah, really good.
Cool. So before we wrap up, is there anything else we've not covered? I'm sure that we've covered everything to the kitchen sink, I think, so far, but is there anything else we've missed?
Oh, God. Possibly, but I can't think what. I'm sure we could probably talk all afternoon. But yeah, no, I think we've covered a lot of stuff. Hopefully it's been interesting for people, not me rambling too much.
I'm sure that's not the case. So if people do have extra questions, where's the best place for people to reach out to you?
I would probably ping me on Twitter. My DMs are open, so it's at Chris_Sainty. And then if you do want to find out anything about what I'm doing or what's going on, I've got my blog, which is chrissainty.com. So I've got a speaking tab on there, which sort of I try to keep up to date with any speaking sort of engagements I've got. And then I did used to post a blog post every week until I started writing this book. And so once the book's finished, there'll be an announcement on there that the book's ready to go. And then hopefully I'll get back in the swing of doing blog posts again and getting stuff going through there as well. So yeah, you can find any other links to any of my other stuff is all on my blog. So you can get to my GitHub from there and all that kind of stuff.
I don't think I've written a blog post since I started this podcast.
I naively thought I'd be able to carry on writing blog posts while I was writing this book. I'll tell you why, because I saw Andrew Locke has written his book for Manning, and he managed to continue to post a blog post every week without fail. And obviously his blog posts are amazing. And I just thought, yeah, I can do that. No, I mean, that guy is superhuman. I have no clue how Andrew puts out the quality of content and the regularity he does. It's stunning. So yeah, I quickly gave up on that idea. I think I managed 3 blog posts in a year.
Well, your next blog post can be all about your book.
Exactly. Yeah. That's what we'll do. And then I'll write a blog post about how I'm getting back into blogging, and then I'll probably just leave it 12 months. That's kind of pretty much standard for blogging, I think.
And then you'll start your next book.
And I'll start my next book, yeah. Oh, God, no, not anytime soon, I'll tell you that.
It's interesting to hear because I've considered doing a book. And it's kind of, whilst this episode has sold me on Blazor, it's not selling me on writing a book.
Yeah, I'm probably a bad person to speak to. I mean, I think I should probably clarify that I do struggle with my reading and stuff. I think I've got a bit of dyslexia type thing. So I struggle when I'm rereading stuff, and I like getting words formed in sentences when I'm writing out sometimes is a bit slow for me. So I'm just slow at it. So I think anybody else would probably be a lot better than I am. But I kind of write stuff out and reread it 3 or 4 times to get it straight in my head, and then I can move on to the next bit. So hence, it's not the fastest in the world. But I get there in the end. That's the point,
That sounds pretty good from what I've read so far.
Yeah, hopefully it doesn't. Hopefully it doesn't fall off a cliff. It should be fine. Hopefully it will all make sense at least. There's a lot of very good people at Manning who are making sure that I don't write crap. So.
Fair enough. Right, so I've realised we've been going on for quite a while, so we should probably wrap up. So a massive thank you, Chris, for joining us. It's been so good having you on to geek out all about Blazor.
Yeah, no, thanks for having me, Dan. It's been an absolute pleasure.
Oh, you're more than welcome back on anytime.
Nice.
So a big thank you to everyone else for listening as well. And a quick reminder that this podcast is sponsored by Everstack, which is my own company providing software development and consultation services. For more information, visit everstack.com. And if you're enjoying the podcast, please do help me spread the word on social media. I normally use the hashtag #unhandledexception, and I can be found on Twitter at Dracan, DRACAN, and my DMs are wide open. And my blog, danclark.com, has links to all my social stuff too, and will include links to everything we've mentioned today in the show notes, which can be found on unhandledexceptionpodcast.com.